February 23, 1945. Iwo Jima. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his back against the volcanic rock inside pillbox number 73, listening to the sound that had come to define his nightmares. Not the thunder of naval guns, not the scream of dive bombers, not even the crack of rifle fire that had killed half his company in the first 3 days of fighting. It was the hiss, a low mechanical whisper that preceded the arrival of liquid fire. Through the narrow gun slit in his bunker, Yamamoto could see him. A Marine, barely 20 yards away, carrying twin tanks on his back that looked almost comical in their bulk. 68 pounds of death compressed into cylinders that caught the morning sun. The Marine moved with methodical precision, covered by 4 riflemen whose weapons tracked every shadow, every potential threat. Yamamoto's hands tightened on his Arisaka rifle. He had been trained for 3 years to hold this position against any American assault. The concrete walls of his pillbox were 4 feet thick. The gun ports had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire with neighboring bunkers. He had ammunition, water, and the Emperor's command to never surrender. None of it mattered when the Marine pulled 2 triggers and sent a jet of napalm-thickened fuel screaming through the firing slit at 2190 degrees Fahrenheit. The weapon that killed Private Yamamoto that morning had been created just 3 years earlier, on Valentine's Day, 1942, in a Harvard chemistry laboratory thousands of miles from the Pacific battlefields, where it would earn its terrible reputation. Professor Louis Fieser had been tasked with solving a problem that seemed almost trivial compared to the grand strategy of global warfare. How do you make gasoline stick? The American military had been using flamethrowers since the First World War, weapons that projected burning fuel against enemy positions, with devastating psychological effect. But gasoline had a fatal flaw. It splashed, it drained. It didn't cling to targets long enough to fully burn through fortifications or overcome defenders. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fieser's solution was elegant and horrifying in equal measure. By combining naphthenic acid and palmitic acid with gasoline, he created a gel that burned longer, dispersed more evenly, and adhered to virtually any surface it touched. The name came from the chemical components. Naphthenic plus palmitic equals napalm. The first batch was mixed in a Harvard laboratory using equipment that would have looked more at home in a high school chemistry class than a weapons development program. But the results were immediately clear. This wasn't just an improvement on existing incendiary weapons. It was a fundamental transformation of how fire could be used in warfare. By mid-1944, American factories were producing napalm at an industrial scale. What began as experimental batches measured in gallons had become a torrent measured in tons. Production jumped from £500,000 in 1943 to £8 million in 1944, and 2/3 of every napalm weapon manufactured during World War II would be used in the Pacific Theatre against Japanese forces who had never encountered anything like it. The weapon arrived at the worst possible time for Japan's defensive strategy. By late 1944, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific had abandoned the doctrine that had cost them dearly in earlier battles. At Tarawa and Guadalcanal, they had tried to stop American landings at the waterline, concentrating their firepower on exposed beaches where Marines struggled through surf and sand. Those tactics had failed catastrophically. The Americans simply brought overwhelming firepower to bear on coastal defences, pounding them with naval artillery and airstrikes until the beachheads could be secured. Japanese casualties were enormous. American casualties were high but acceptable. The Empire needed a new strategy. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood this better than most. Given command of Iwo Jima's defences in May 1944, he made a radical decision that would define Japanese defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war. Instead of fighting on the beaches, he would fight from beneath them. Kuribayashi's engineers spent 7 months carving an elaborate warren of tunnels into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock. 18 kilometers of passages connected bunkers, artillery positions, command posts, and supply depots, in a network designed to be virtually indestructible from the air or sea. Machine gun nests were positioned with interlocking fields of fire. Mortar pits were dug deep enough to survive direct hits from battleship shells. Every position had multiple escape routes through underground passages. The defensive network was brilliant, thorough, and built on assumptions about American weapons that were already obsolete by the time the first Marines waded ashore on February 19, 1945. The Japanese had prepared for high-explosive shells and armor-piercing bombs. They had hardened their positions against grenades and small arms fire. They had calculated firing angles and ammunition loads for a conventional battle. They had not prepared for fire that could flow like water and stick like glue. The M2 flamethrower that became standard issue for Marine assault teams in late 1944 represented the practical application of Fieser's chemistry. Two cylindrical tanks mounted on a backpack frame held 4 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel and pressurized nitrogen. The system weighed 68 pounds fully loaded, making the operator a slow-moving target that Japanese snipers learned to prioritize. But those who survived to get within range possessed a weapon that could defeat fortifications designed to be impregnable. The napalm left the projector nozzle as a tight, dark stream that could reach 40 yards under ideal conditions. When it hit a target, it spread and burned for 8 to 10 seconds, with flames hot enough to consume the oxygen inside enclosed spaces and cook the air to lethal temperatures. The weapon didn't just kill through direct burning, though that was horrific enough. It killed through oxygen depletion, turning bunkers into suffocation chambers. It killed through heat stroke, raising temperatures inside concrete pillboxes to levels that cooked defenders alive, even if the flames never touched them directly. And it killed through pure terror, breaking the will of soldiers who had been trained to prefer death over surrender. Corporal Herschel Williams carried one of these weapons up the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima on February 23, 1945. At 5 feet 6 inches tall and barely 21 years old, he looked like an unlikely harbinger of revolution in warfare. But Williams had volunteered for flamethrower duty after watching tanks bog down in the volcanic sand, unable to advance against Japanese positions that commanded the approaches to the interior of the island. The Japanese defensive network on Iwo Jima was everything Kuribayashi had promised. Concrete pillboxes with walls 4 feet thick, gun ports positioned to create killing zones, underground tunnels that allowed defenders to reoccupy positions that Marines thought they had cleared. Every cave entrance, every bunker, every fighting position had been designed to extract maximum casualties from attackers following conventional infantry tactics. Williams spent 4 hours that morning, proving that conventional tactics were no longer necessary. With 4 riflemen providing covering fire, he crawled from one Japanese position to the next, methodically burning out each bunker with controlled bursts of napalm. When he ran low on fuel, he crawled back to Marine lines for a fresh flamethrower, then returned to continue his assault. At one pillbox, he spotted smoke escaping from a ventilation hole in the roof. He climbed onto the concrete structure, inserted the nozzle of his flamethrower into the vent, and fired a sustained burst directly into the fortification's interior. The Japanese soldiers inside had no escape route that didn't require running through flames. The position fell silent within seconds. The tactical implications were immediately clear to both sides. American forces had found a weapon that could neutralize the most sophisticated defensive preparations Japanese engineers could design. And Japanese soldiers, watching their carefully prepared positions burn, understood that their defensive strategy had been rendered obsolete by a weapon they had no effective counter for. By nightfall on February 23rd, Williams had destroyed 7 major pillboxes and numerous smaller positions. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. But more significantly, word of the flamethrower's effectiveness spread through both armies with the speed that only combat veterans can achieve. American commanders began requesting more flamethrower-equipped units. Japanese soldiers began reporting a new and overwhelming fear that conventional weapons training had not prepared them for. The psychological impact of napalm was proving as devastating as its physical effects. Lieutenant Masao Hayashi commanded a company defending a cave complex on the northern end of Iwo Jima. His position had been carved deep into volcanic rock, with multiple chambers connected by tunnels that provided excellent protection against artillery and airstrikes. He had 47 soldiers under his command, adequate ammunition, and water for 10 days. On February 26th, a Marine flamethrower team reached his position. Hayashi watched through a concealed observation slit as the American soldiers approached. He ordered his machine gunners to hold fire, waiting for the optimal moment to open up on the advancing Marines. The tactics he had learned in training said to wait until the enemy was committed, exposed, unable to retreat quickly. Then he saw the twin tanks on the lead Marine's back and understood that every tactical assumption he had been taught was about to become irrelevant. The first burst of napalm didn't enter Hayashi's cave. It splashed against the rock face near the entrance, spreading and burning, creating a wall of flame that made observation impossible and drove temperatures inside the cave network to oven-like levels within minutes. The Marines didn't need to storm the position. They just needed to make it uninhabitable. Hayashi made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. He ordered his men to abandon the cave through a rear exit, or tunnel, withdrawing deeper into the island rather than dying in a position that had become a death trap. Of his 47 soldiers, 32 reached the secondary defensive line. 15 died from heat stroke and oxygen depletion before they could escape the burning cave. The survivors spread word through the Japanese defensive network. The Americans had a weapon that made underground positions into crematoriums. The thick concrete walls that were supposed to protect defenders had become walls of a furnace. The carefully designed firing ports that provided excellent fields of fire had become chimneys that channeled napalm into living quarters. By early March, Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima were receiving reports that fundamentally changed their understanding of the tactical situation. Positions that should have held for days were falling in hours. Soldiers trained to fight to the death were requesting permission to withdraw. Officers were reporting casualties from weapons that killed without ever directly striking their targets. The weapon they feared wasn't the battleship guns that had pounded the island for 3 days before the invasion. It wasn't the carrier-based aircraft that could deliver bombs with reasonable accuracy. It wasn't even the tanks that Marine forces had landed to support their infantry advances. It was the flamethrower, carried by individual soldiers who could get close enough to turn defensive strongpoints into ovens. The tactical revolution happening on Iwo Jima was being replicated on every island where American and Japanese forces clashed. On Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and throughout the Philippines, Marine and Army assault teams were discovering that napalm-equipped flamethrowers could crack defensive networks that had been designed to be impregnable. But the real transformation in napalm warfare was happening not on the ground, but in the air. While individual Marines carried 4 gallons of napalm in backpack flamethrowers, American bomber crews were preparing to deliver the weapon by the ton against targets that couldn't defend themselves and had nowhere to hide. The firebombing campaign that would devastate Japan's cities was still being planned in early 1945. But the weapons were ready, the tactics were being refined, and the strategic logic that would lead to Operation Meeting House was already taking shape in planning rooms thousands of miles from the Pacific battlefields. Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945 with orders to find more effective ways to strike at Japan's industrial capacity. The high-altitude precision bombing that had worked reasonably well in Europe was proving ineffective against Japanese cities, where small workshops scattered throughout residential neighborhoods produced critical components for the war machine. Weather was part of the problem. Cloud cover and high winds at bombing altitudes made accurate targeting nearly impossible. The jet stream, which American pilots had discovered the hard way, could carry bombs hundreds of yards off target, even when the bombardier's aim was perfect. But LeMay was also dealing with a more fundamental challenge. Japanese cities weren't built like European cities. There were few large factory complexes that could be destroyed in a single raid. Manufacturing was distributed, decentralized, embedded in neighborhoods where extended families lived and worked in structures made primarily of wood and paper. The solution that emerged was as obvious as it was terrible. If precision bombing couldn't destroy distributed manufacturing, then area bombing with incendiaries might be more effective. And the most effective incendiary available was napalm. The M69 incendiary bomb became the primary weapon in the campaign that would kill more civilians than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The device was simple: a hollow tube filled with napalm gel and white phosphorus, designed to punch through the thin roofing material common in Japanese residential architecture, then ignite and spray burning gel throughout the interior of the structure. Each B-29 Superfortress could carry approximately 7 tons of these weapons, packaged in E-46 cluster bombs that released 38 individual incendiaries at an altitude of 2,000 feet. The bomblets would fall like rain across entire city blocks, starting hundreds of separate fires that would merge into conflagrations too large for any firefighting force to contain. The first major test of this strategy came on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, when 334 B-29s departed from bases in the Mariana Islands bound for Tokyo. The target was the Shitamachi district, a densely populated working-class neighborhood on the east side of the city, where countless small workshops supported Japan's war production. The bombers flew at night, at low altitude, stripped of most defensive armament to carry maximum bomb loads. It was a calculated risk. Flying low exposed the aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and night fighters, but it also dramatically improved accuracy and ensured that the incendiaries would hit their intended targets. Pathfinder aircraft arrived first, marking the target area with napalm bombs that formed a giant X across the Shitamachi district. Then the main force began their bombing runs, dropping load after load of M69 incendiaries across 16 square miles of densely populated city. What happened next was beyond anything the mission planners had anticipated. Within the first 2 hours, rapidly spreading fires had overwhelmed Tokyo's firefighting capabilities completely. The individual blazes merged into a firestorm, a phenomenon where intense heat creates its own weather system. Winds reached hurricane force as cooler air rushed in to replace superheated air rising above the burning city. Temperatures at ground level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Michiko Kiyo was 17 years old, working the night shift at a small machine shop that produced precision parts for aircraft instruments. Her workshop employed 12 people, operating out of a converted residential structure in the heart of the Shitamachi district. When the air raid sirens began wailing at approximately 11 p.m., she and her co-workers followed the prescribed protocol, gathering their emergency supplies and preparing to evacuate to the nearest designated shelter. The first incendiaries fell 3 blocks away. Kiyo watched through the workshop's windows as the night sky lit up with hundreds of small explosions, each one spawning a jet of flame that spread across rooftops and walls. The sound was unlike anything she had heard before. Not the sharp crack of high-explosive bombs, but a softer, more sinister whoosh as the napalm ignited. Within 10 minutes, the fires had spread to surrounding blocks. Within 20 minutes, the workshop where Kiyo worked was surrounded by flames on 3 sides. The evacuation route to the shelter had become impassable, blocked by walls of fire that consumed everything in their path. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kiyo and her co-workers made the decision that would save 8 of their 12 lives. Instead of trying to reach the shelter, they ran toward the Sumida River, 3 blocks to the east. The route took them through streets that were transforming into corridors of flame, past buildings that exploded as the fire reached interior gas lines, through air so hot that breathing became painful. The river was already crowded with thousands of other residents who had made the same calculation. Some waded into the water to escape the heat, others huddled on the riverbank, soaked blankets pulled over their heads for protection against the radiant heat that could kill without direct flame contact. Kyo survived by submerging herself in the river whenever the heat became unbearable, surfacing only long enough to breathe before ducking back under the water. She remained there for 6 hours, from midnight until dawn, watching the city burn while the B-29s continued their bombing runs overhead. When the all-clear finally sounded and Kyo emerged from the river, the Shitamachi district had ceased to exist as a functional neighborhood. 16 square miles of urban landscape had been reduced to ash and rubble. The machine shop where she worked was gone. The shelter where her workshop group had originally planned to evacuate had taken a direct hit from cluster bombs, killing everyone inside. The casualty count from Operation Meeting House exceeded 100,000 dead in a single night. Some estimates placed the number even higher, approaching 140,000. In less than 3 hours, more civilians died in Tokyo than would later die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, and napalm had been the weapon that made it possible. But the tactical and psychological dimensions of napalm warfare were proving even more significant than the sheer scale of destruction. American forces were discovering that napalm didn't just kill. It broke the will to resist in ways that conventional weapons could not. On Okinawa, the last major island battle before the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, American forces brought flamethrower tanks to supplement the portable weapons that individual soldiers carried. These M4A3 Sherman tanks had been modified by Navy Seabees to mount a flamethrower in place of the bow machine gun, fed by tanks that held 300 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel. The Marines called them Zippos, after the popular cigarette lighter. The Japanese called them something that translates roughly as the Hell Machines. Technical Sergeant David Chen commanded one of these Zippo tanks during the battle for Shuri Castle, a medieval fortress that had been converted into a key defensive position by Japanese forces. The castle's walls were centuries old, thick stone that had weathered typhoons and earthquakes. The underground chambers had been expanded and reinforced with concrete, creating a maze of tunnels and fighting positions that could shelter hundreds of defenders. Conventional tactics said you suppressed such positions with artillery, then sent infantry to clear them room by room with grenades and small arms fire. Casualties would be high. Progress would be measured in yards per day. The defenders would exact a terrible price for every foot of ground. Chen's Zippo offered an alternative. Drive to within 150 yards of the target, traverse the flamethrower to aim at the entrance, and send a jet of liquid fire streaming into the interior. The napalm would flow through corridors and chambers like water seeking its level, burning everything it touched and consuming oxygen from spaces the flames couldn't directly reach. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Japanese soldiers who had been trained to fight to the death, who had been indoctrinated to view surrender as the ultimate dishonor, began emerging from positions with their hands raised after a single burst of napalm fire. Officers reported that their troops were abandoning defensive positions that should have been held for days. American intelligence officers, interrogating prisoners taken on Okinawa, documented testimony that would be repeated on every Pacific battlefield where napalm was employed. The prisoners weren't afraid of artillery shells. They had learned to shelter from bombs during air raids. They could endure rifle fire and mortar barrages, and even tank assaults. But the flamethrowers terrified them in ways that conventional weapons never had. One captured Japanese soldier, a 23-year-old corporal named Hiroshi Nakamura, tried to explain through a translator why he had surrendered after a Zippo tank attacked his cave position. "The fire finds you wherever you hide," he said. "It flows through passages like water. It burns the air so you cannot breathe. It creates heat that cooks you alive, even if the flames never touch your skin. You cannot fight it. You cannot escape it. You can only die or surrender." Nakamura had been trained for 3 years in defensive warfare. He had been taught that Japanese soldiers were superior in spirit to American forces, that determination and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. He had believed the propaganda that said Americans were soft, unwilling to pay the price for victory, likely to give up when casualties mounted. The flamethrower had shattered every assumption his training had instilled. This was a weapon that seemed specifically designed to defeat the defensive tactics Japanese commanders had developed. Underground positions became death traps. Concrete fortifications became ovens. The Bushido code that demanded death before dishonor seemed suddenly irrelevant when the alternative was burning alive in a cave with no possibility of fighting back. By June 1945, American commanders throughout the Pacific were reporting that flamethrower-equipped units were achieving breakthrough success against defensive positions that should have required days or weeks to reduce. On Okinawa alone, the 713th Provisional Flamethrower Battalion expended more than 200,000 gallons of napalm against Japanese cave positions. The weapon had proven so effective that the United States military had given flamethrower tank production the same AAA procurement priority as the B-29 bomber and the atomic bomb project. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American factories had produced 354 flamethrower tanks, with another 70 ready for deployment in the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. But the air campaign had already demonstrated what napalm could do when delivered on a truly massive scale. Between March and August 1945, American B-29s dropped approximately 40,000 tons of napalm incendiaries on 67 Japanese cities. The campaign killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, destroyed half of Tokyo's industrial capacity, and left millions homeless. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war would conclude that the incendiary attacks had been more effective at damaging Japan's war economy than precision bombing of industrial targets. The small workshops and distributed manufacturing that characterized Japanese industry were vulnerable to firebombing in ways that concentrated factories were not. But the survey also documented something that had been visible to anyone who studied prisoner interrogation reports or examined Japanese defensive doctrine in the war's final months. Napalm had achieved a psychological impact that went beyond its physical destruction. It had become the weapon Japanese soldiers feared more than any other in the American arsenal. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe commanded a coastal defense battery on Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island, in July 1945. His unit had been positioned to defend against the American invasion that intelligence reports indicated would come in the fall. They had adequate ammunition, well-constructed positions, and orders to fight to the last man. Watanabe knew about the firebombing campaigns that had devastated Japan's cities. He had seen refugees streaming south from Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, with stories of walls of flame and streets turned into rivers of fire. But his concern wasn't about air raids against his position. Coastal defense batteries were military targets, and military targets were attacked with high-explosive bombs, not incendiaries. Then he received a briefing from intelligence officers who had debriefed survivors from Okinawa. The Americans, he learned, had developed tanks that could project napalm 150 yards. They had portable flamethrowers that individual soldiers could carry into battle. They had demonstrated a willingness to use these weapons liberally against any defensive position they encountered. The implications were clear to Watanabe and his officers. The concrete bunkers they had built to withstand naval bombardment would become ovens when American flamethrower tanks arrived. The underground ammunition magazines that protected shells from air attack would become death traps if napalm fire reached them. The defensive network they had spent months preparing was vulnerable to a weapon they had no effective counter for. For the first time in his military career, Watanabe found himself questioning whether the tactics his commanders were planning would actually work. The doctrine said you held your position. You made the enemy pay in blood for every yard of ground. You extracted casualties until the cost of victory became unacceptable. But how do you hold a position when the enemy has a weapon that makes the position itself lethal to its defenders? How do you exact casualties when attempting to fight back means exposing yourself to liquid fire? How do you maintain unit cohesion when soldiers have seen what napalm does to human bodies? The surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, meant Watanabe would never have to answer those questions. But the psychological burden of knowing what was coming had already taken its toll. In his journal, recovered decades after the war, he wrote that the prospect of facing American flamethrowers terrified him more than the atomic bombs that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. "The atomic bomb kills instantly," he wrote. "There is no time for fear, no prolonged suffering, but the flamethrower. That is a death I cannot face with honor." The legacy of napalm warfare in the Pacific extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories it enabled. The weapon had fundamentally changed how both sides thought about defensive warfare, about the relationship between fortifications and vulnerability, about the limits of human endurance in combat. Japanese commanders studying the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa understood that their carefully prepared defensive networks had been rendered obsolete by a weapon they couldn't counter. The underground positions that should have been impregnable had proven fatally vulnerable. The Bushido Code that demanded soldiers fight to the death had been tested by a form of death that was so terrible that even the most dedicated soldiers sometimes chose surrender. American commanders, meanwhile, had discovered a weapon that could break defensive positions designed to be unbreakable. The flamethrower had proven essential on every Pacific battlefield in the war's final year. Plans for the invasion of Japan's home islands called for massive expansion of flamethrower-equipped units, both portable and tank-mounted, specifically because intelligence indicated the Japanese were preparing extensive underground defensive networks. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 prevented that invasion. But the strategic calculations that led to the decision to use those weapons had been informed by casualty estimates based on the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And in those battles, despite the availability of flamethrowers and napalm, American casualties had been staggering. More than 6,000 killed and 19,000 wounded on Iwo Jima alone. Nearly 13,000 killed and 36,000 wounded on Okinawa. What would the casualty figures have been without napalm? How many additional months would those battles have lasted if American forces had been restricted to conventional weapons? The questions were never answered definitively, but the tactical evidence was clear. Flamethrowers had been essential to victory in the island campaigns. Marines and soldiers who had carried those weapons, or fought alongside those who did, credited them with saving American lives by breaking defensive positions that could not have been taken any other way. But the weapon's effectiveness came at a moral cost that American society would spend decades grappling with. The incendiary bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly people who had no direct role in the war effort, raised questions about the limits of acceptable warfare that remain unresolved to this day. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, who died in his pillbox on Iwo Jima when napalm fire consumed the oxygen he needed to breathe, had been 19 years old. He had been drafted into the army in 1943, trained for 6 months, and shipped to an island he had never heard of to defend a position he knew he would probably die defending. Michiko Kiyo, who survived Operation Meeting House by spending 6 hours submerged in the Sumida River, was 17. She had been working in a small machine shop because industrial production was critical to the war effort, and every able-bodied person was expected to contribute. The parts her shop produced had undoubtedly found their way into aircraft that killed American servicemen. Both were casualties of a weapon that killed without discrimination, that turned defensive positions into crematoriums and cities into infernos, that broke the will to resist through the application of fire hot enough to melt steel. The silence that settled over the Pacific Islands in August 1945 carried the weight of millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, societies transformed by the machinery of industrial warfare. The napalm weapons that had proven so devastating in the war's final year would be retired, then resurrected for Korea and Vietnam, each time generating the same moral questions about weapons that killed so effectively and so terribly. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, the historical verdict is clear. Japanese forces feared American napalm strikes more than any other weapon in the American arsenal, not because napalm killed more efficiently than bombs or bullets, not because it caused more total casualties than naval bombardment or artillery fire, They feared it because it was specifically designed to defeat the defensive tactics they had developed, because it transformed their strongest positions into death traps, because it killed in ways that were so terrible that even soldiers trained to prefer death over surrender sometimes chose the dishonor of captivity rather than face the flamethrower's jet of liquid fire. The weapon that Louis Fieser had developed in a Harvard laboratory on Valentine's Day, 1942, had become the physical manifestation of America's industrial capacity turned toward total war. The ability to produce napalm by the ton, to deliver it by air and by hand, to use it without hesitation against any target that threatened American forces, demonstrated a commitment to victory that ultimately proved overwhelming. Japanese commanders had built fortress islands. They had trained soldiers willing to die rather than retreat. They had developed defensive tactics designed to extract maximum casualties from attackers. But they had no counter for a weapon that made fortresses into ovens, that killed soldiers without allowing them to fight back, that turned carefully prepared defensive positions into indefensible death traps. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.